That night seemed like every other at St. Michael's orphanage. Cold, silent, and steeped in a routine time had forgotten. The ancient brick walls exuded dampness and memory, while the rhythmic patter of rain against the stained glass windows reminded everyone that the world outside still moved. In the master bedroom, lit by a flickering bulb, shadows stretched across the polished floor, dancing like figures caught between sleep and oblivion. Between the precisely aligned beds, a 9-year-old boy lay awake, watching the ceiling with a look of mingled fear and understanding, as if he knew something the others couldn't. His name was Jaden Cross, and that night he refused to climb into the top bunk. The other children slept silently, but he remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the bed above, his body tense, his lips trembling. When his caregiver, Sister Louise, came over and whispered patiently, "Jaden, honey, come upstairs, it's cold." He just shook his head. She tried to smile, but her laughter sounded hollow as the boy murmured in a barely audible whisper, "I'm sorry. There's someone in there, looking at me." The nun froze, wind blew through the cracks, the light bulb flickered, and for a second, the mattress seemed to dip slightly, as if something was breathing beneath the fabric. Feigning calm, she turned off the lamp and walked away, but fear was already following her. Hours later, at 3:17 in the morning, a scream pierced the orphanage, cutting through the silence like a blade. When they arrived, Jaden wasn't crying, just smiling, staring at the empty bunk bed. But what was really in that bed? A dream, a presence, or something that should never have woken up? If this story has already left your heart racing and your mind full of questions, subscribe now and leave a like, because what comes next will prove to you that some secrets never truly rest. St. Michael's Orphanage sat isolated on a hilltop in rural Georgia, surrounded by gnarled oak trees, and a fog that never seemed to lift. Built at the beginning of the last century, the building had been a convent, then a war hospital, before becoming a shelter for orphaned and abandoned children. Its walls were marked by cracks and a constant dampness that made the air heavy and cold, even on warm days. Here, time didn't pass. It just accumulated. The director, Sister Margaret, was a woman with a firm gaze and a controlled voice. She had unshakable faith, but little patience for what she called childish superstitions. When she heard the story of Jaden's behavior, she simply said that imagination is the first refuge of the fearful. For her, the boy needed discipline, not attention. Her decisions were always final and rarely brooked debate. However, even she began to notice that something had changed in the atmosphere of the orphanage since that night. The main hallway, which had previously sounded empty, now seemed to breathe. Some caregivers swore they heard light footsteps in the early morning, as if a barefoot child were crossing the halls. Others claimed to smell a sweet metallic odor coming from Jaden's dorm, a scent reminiscent of dead flowers mixed with iron. The nuns glanced at each other but avoided comment. Silence was part of the rules, and in that place so was fear. The morning after the scream, the officer Harris, he was called. A middle-aged man, skeptical and pragmatic, he believed in nothing beyond what he could touch. He entered the dormitory with his clipboard in hand, took a quick look and smiled quietly. "Children dream, that's all," he said. He jotted down a few words, promised to return if anything more serious happened, and left, leaving behind the echo of the creaking of the ancient doors. But before he left, he felt something strange, a slight pressure in his chest, as if the air were thicker in that room than anywhere else in the building. He ignored the discomfort, preferring to blame it on mold and claustrophobia. Even so, as he crossed the threshold, he took one last look at the dorm window and saw Jaden standing there, watching him with a distant, almost adult expression, as if trying to say something that couldn't be said. That afternoon, Sister Margaret ordered the mattress changed. The caretaker, a man with calloused hands and a vacant stare, responded only with a, "Yes, ma'am." But when he approached the bed, he hesitated for a brief second. The silence that felt alive, heavy and expectant. The orphanage continued its seemingly normal routine, but everyone knew, even if they couldn't admit it, that something inside that room remained awake. And over the following nights, the fear began to shift, from just one boy's to everyone who slept under that roof. Because when a child's fear spreads among adults, it's a sign that evil has found a new home. In the days that followed, the orphanage's routine seemed to have returned to normal. The children returned to their makeshift classes in the main hall. The nuns resumed their daily prayers, and silence once again filled the hallways. But the silence there was never complete. There was always a distant whisper, something moving between the walls like a memory that wouldn't die. And it was in this atmosphere of apparent tranquility that the behavior of Jaden Cross began to become even more disturbing. He no longer played with the other children, nor did he answer the caregivers' questions. He spent much of his time sitting in a corner of the room, an old notebook in his hands. There he incessantly drew the same image, a bed, a mattress, and inside it, something that looked like an eye. Each line was firm, almost adult-like, and the more he drew, the more the room filled with a tension no one could name. The nuns began collecting his drawings, worried about their retention. But each time the paper was removed, another, identical, appeared in the same place. Some began to think he drew in his sleep, because one night, one of the caretakers found him standing on the edge of his bunk bed, pencil in hand, his eyes wide open but dull. The notebook lay on the floor with a new drawing, the torn mattress and a small blue ribbon drawn inside. In the hallways, the rumor grew. The other kids avoided the dorm, saying Jaden heard things. One of them said she'd seen him talking to himself in the wee hours of the morning, as if a voice were answering him. And when they asked what he heard, he simply said, "She tells me what they did." These words left a chill in the air. Sister Margaret ordered him to be isolated for a few days, claiming he needed reflection and silence. But it was during this time that the phenomena began to spread. The wall clock always stopped at the same time, 3:17 a.m. The dormitory's light bulbs would all burn out at once, and every morning the top mattress would appear slightly shifted, as if someone had pushed it during the night. Gradually, the fear shifted from the boy to what he might be bringing too. Light. Even the nuns, accustomed to decades of silence, began to pray more earnestly, while the priest in charge of the orphanage chapel avoided the dormitory without explanation. But Jaden didn't seem scared. On the contrary, he seemed increasingly serene, as if he understood something the adults couldn't. One night, when one of his caregivers tried to get him to sleep, he looked at her with a disturbing calm and said, "She doesn't want to hurt anyone. She just wants to be remembered." The woman left crying without understanding why. The next morning, when they opened the room, they found the mattress covered in small pencil drawings. All the same, a girl with braids and a blue ribbon in her hair looking up. And it was at that moment that everyone realized Jaden wasn't just afraid of the bunk bed. He was being guided by something that still lived inside him. From that morning on, the air inside the dormitory began to change. The sweet smell that had previously been barely perceptible had now become dense, as if the air itself carried ancient memories. The odor of damp wood mixed with iron spread throughout the room, impregnating the sheets, clothes, and even the walls. The caretakers lit candles and left the windows open, but to no avail. The smell returned, always stronger, always at night. The children began sleeping in other rooms, claiming they heard footsteps coming from inside the mattress. Sister Margaret forbade comment, fearing panic among the children, but the silence only made things more oppressive. One of the nuns, Sister Clarice, reported hearing, shortly after midnight, the sound of fingernails scratching the fabric of the top bunk. When she summoned the courage to look, she noticed the mattress moving slightly, as if breathing. That same night, the clock in the hallway stopped again at 3:17, the same time as Jaden's scream weeks earlier. That's when a group of children began to cry, claiming to have heard a female voice calling his name. Their desperation was so great that Sister Margaret ordered everyone to pray. But as she chanted the "Our Father," one of the candles went out on its own, plunging the room into a nearly living darkness. During the day, Jaden seemed distant. He continued to draw, but now his drawings had something new: small dark shapes around the bed, elongated shadows that seemed to move. Sometimes he would stop drawing and just stare at the mattress, as if listening to someone inside it. When asked what it was, he would answer, "She wants to leave, but they won't let her." Sister Margaret tried to remain rational, claiming the boy was suffering from some kind of trauma. However, even she began to doubt this when, one afternoon, the caretaker tried to turn the mattress over and noticed that the bottom part was heavier than usual. He said it seemed to contain something solid, like wood or iron, inside the foam. The headmistress, visibly disturbed, ordered him to stop immediately and put it back. That night, the entire orphanage was filled with a series of noises, thuds, cracks, and finally a muffled sound reminiscent of sobbing. No one dared leave their room. Until dawn, the nuns prayed in silence, as if the mere mention of it might awaken something even more ancient. Jaden, however, woke up calm, as if nothing had happened. He walked to the bunk, ran his hand over the mattress, and whispered something no one understood. He smiled briefly, then turned to Sister Margaret and said, "She won't wait any longer." The calm tone of those words silenced even the most skeptical, and from that early morning on, fear stopped being a rumor. It became part of the orphanage's routine. But what had truly awakened inside had not yet shown its face. After weeks of tension, the headmistress decided it was time to put an end to it. She summoned the caretaker, a man with few teeth and a hardened expression, to conduct a thorough inspection of the dormitory. "No spirits, no superstitions," she said firmly, trying to convince herself more than anyone else. Sister Clarice watched from afar, wringing her hands, as the man approached Jaden's bed with slow, almost respectful steps. The top mattress was intact at first glance, but when he pressed the center with his hands, something inside seemed to give way. The fabric made a low sound, as if air was escaping. "It's just a little old-looking, nothing major," he muttered, trying to hide his discomfort. However, when he turned the mattress over to examine the bottom, the strong smell that emanated from it made the nuns immediately recoil. A bittersweet, heavy odor, impossible to ignore. "Maybe an animal got in underneath, or something's rotting inside," the caretaker ventured, as Sister Margaret ordered him to be taken outside. Jaden watched silently, his eyes watering as if every movement were a violent act. When the man tried to lift the mattress, the boy lunged forward and grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "Don't touch!" "Ha!" he shouted, his voice hoarse and his expression unbecoming of a child. The scene caused panic. The nuns rushed to pull him away, and Jaden fell to the ground, crying desperately, repeating a single sentence between sobs. "She feels pain when they move her." Officer Harris was called again. Upon arriving, he looked at the mattress, at the boy, and in a weary tone said there was nothing there but mold and imagination. He asked everyone to calm down, filed the case as a psychological disturbance, and left, leaving the atmosphere even more tense than before. That night, the mattress was returned to its place. No words were spoken, but everyone slept with the feeling that something was watching them in the dark. The sound of light footsteps was heard again around 3 in the morning, followed by muffled crying from inside the bed. The next day, Jaden woke up pale and feverish. He said he'd dreamed of a girl trapped inside a windowless room. when Sister Clarice asked who she was. He replied in a barely audible voice, "Her name is Grace." From that moment on, something changed in the way even the most skeptical viewed the case. Fear stopped being just superstition and began to take shape. And although Sister Margaret tried to maintain appearances of order and rationality, deep down she knew that the truth was only beginning to reveal itself. But no one imagined that the next sign would be impossible to ignore and would change everything forever. That early morning, the orphanage seemed to breathe along with the storm. The wind blew through the cracks in the windows and made the doors vibrate in an irregular rhythm, as if someone were tapping lightly on the other side. The sound of rain falling on the roof mingled with the rustling of the curtains, and the cold seemed more intense inside the building than outside. It was as if the air was saturated with something invisible, a silent presence, watching, waiting for the right moment to manifest itself. Jaden slept in his bottom bunk, but his sleep was restless, filled with murmurs that escaped through his teeth. At one point, the boy slowly rose, his bare feet touching the cold floor, and walked toward the top bunk, the same one he had avoided since day one. The nuns, gathered in prayer on the lower floor, heard a dull thud coming from the dormitory, as if something had fallen. They hurried upstairs, and when they opened the door, what they saw made their blood run cold. Jaden was standing beside the mattress, his hands on the fabric, his eyes fixed and wide as if in a trance. Sister Clarice called out to him in a trembling voice, but he didn't respond. He merely slowly turned his face toward her, and in a low, hoarse tone, said something that silenced the room. "She's in here." Before anyone could react, the lamp flickered and went out for a moment. When it came back on, the women noticed a phrase written in white chalk on the wall just above the bunk. They left her locked up. The terror was immediate. Sister Margaret rushed to erase the words, but the more she tried to rub, the more they seemed to spread, as if the chalk was stuck to the plaster itself. Officer Harris was called in a hurry for the third time. He entered the rain-soaked orphanage with the suspicious look of someone who no longer believed in anything, but upon seeing the state of the nuns, he momentarily lost his ironic tone. The atmosphere was heavy, the air thin. Each breath seemed to carry a metallic taste, almost like blood. He asked everyone to leave the room and, alone, approached the mattress. He placed his hand on the fabric, and for a second he felt something warm. A light, pulsing, almost organic vibration. He immediately withdrew his hand and left silently, without explaining what he had felt. That night, no one tried to sleep again. The nuns prayed as a group. The children were moved to other rooms, and Jaden remained under observation in the principal's office. He didn't cry, didn't speak, just stared blankly into space, his expression too serene for a child. Before leaving, the police officer approached Sister Margaret and said, his voice deep and with an uncontrollable shiver, "Whatever it is, it's not your imagination. It's breathing with the house." Outside, the wind suddenly died, as if the sky itself waited in silence. The orphanage seemed to have stopped breathing for a moment, and for the first time, even the doubters began to realize that whatever inhabited that mattress wasn't just trying to be remembered, it was trying to return. But no one was prepared for what they would find when the truth finally began to emerge from the walls of that place. The next morning, the rain had stopped, but the orphanage seemed even darker, as if the clouds refused to completely go away. The police officer Harris, who until then had dismissed the case as a mere childish disturbance, awoke before dawn to the insistent ringing of the telephone. On the other end, Sister Margaret's weary voice requested his immediate presence. "The boy, he knows her name," she said softly, almost fearing someone else would overhear. That sentence silenced him for a moment, Apparently, the child's imagination had taken shape, a name, and perhaps a past. And Harris, who had always believed that every mystery had a logical explanation, was beginning to feel he was becoming embroiled in something logic could not explain. Arriving at the orphanage, he found Jaden, sitting silently, his eyes lost on the wall. On the table in front of him was a piece of paper with a single name written in shaky letters: Grace Holloway. Beside it, the same old pattern: the bunk bed, the mattress, and a small blue ribbon tied to the corner. Sister Margaret, pale, held an old ledger, the kind that dust turned into a relic. There was a girl by that name here. 17 years ago, he murmured. She disappeared in 2006, never found. Harris flipped through the ledger and saw the photo. A little girl with big eyes and a sweet smile, with a blue ribbon in her hair. The coincidence was unsettling. To confirm, he took the case to the local city hall. In the dusty county archives, he found the original missing persons report. Grace had disappeared in the early hours of the morning from the same dorm where Jaden now slept. The janitor at the time, Thomas Bell, had been questioned, but the case was closed due to lack of evidence. Bell had died 3 years later, under circumstances that were never clarified. The officer, upon reading this information, felt his stomach churn. He returned to the orphanage, determined to question the boy. But upon entering the office, he found Jaden with his head bowed, muttering a phrase repeated like a prayer: "She doesn't want to hurt, she just wants them to know." Meanwhile, the social worker Anne Lewis, called to follow the case, arrived at the scene with the coolness of someone who had seen much pain, but never anything like this. She tried to talk to Jaden, but he seemed oblivious. Until, when she showed him Grace's photograph, the boy slowly raised his eyes and stared at her with a calmness that bordered on the unsettling. "She's still here," he said. Pointing to the ceiling, he added, "below what was sealed." Harris, watching the scene, felt a shiver run down his spine. That night, they decided to search the room again. Each footstep echoed as if the building were breathing. When they reached the bunk, the officer turned on his flashlight and noticed something unusual: a stitched line on the underside of the mattress, as if the fabric had been ripped open and hastily mended. Anne approached and ran her fingers over the seam. "This isn't from the factory," he said in a barely audible voice. Harris watched her in silence, the sound of the rain starting up again outside, as if the night itself could hear it. Sister Margaret, who had been fighting fear until then, burst into tears. "I didn't know. My God, I didn't know." But Jaden, standing beside the bed, just watched. No tears, no tremors. There was a serenity about him unbecoming of his age, as if he already knew the outcome of everything. The police officer took a deep breath, took the knife from his pocket and lightly cut the fabric. The sound of the rip was dry, almost muffled. A cold wind swept through the room, and for a brief moment, all the candles went out at once. The mattress seemed to pulsate, and the silence that followed was so profound that fear itself could be heard. And while everyone looked at that object that had become the center of the nightmare, Jaden, in an almost sweet whisper, said, "She waited too long." At that moment, the police officer knew there was no turning back. St. Michael's Orphanage was no longer just a forgotten institution. It had become the tomb of a secret that was about to be unearthed. But what was hidden inside that mattress wasn't just evidence of a crime. It was the echo of something much deeper, something that still breathed. The cut in the mattress, which began as a simple scratch, became a complete rip, revealing the interior, warped and yellowed by years of dampness. The foam split like old fabric, and the smell that escaped was thick, bittersweet like a materialized lament. The nuns recoiled, some covering their faces, others murmuring prayers between their lips. Officer Harris held the flashlight steady, but the tremor in his hands betrayed him. Anne Lewis, trying to contain her own terror, took a deep breath and carefully pulled at one edge of the fabric. Something slid out, falling to the floor with a dry, fragile sound. It was a blue ribbon, faded and stiffened by time. The silence that formed in that instant seemed alive, pulsating, as if the orphanage itself were holding its breath. Jaden approached slowly, his eyes fixed on the ribbon. None of the nuns stopped him, perhaps because they felt he was the only one who understood the object's significance. The boy knelt, gently picked up the ribbon and held it close to his chest. "It's hers," he said in a low, almost affectionate voice. The words pierced the room like a sharp whisper. Then Harris reached into the mattress and pulled out something small and cold. A small gold chain covered in dark, rusty stains with a heart-shaped pendant. Inside was a miniature photograph, a little girl with braids wearing the same blue ribbon. It was Grace Holloway. The discovery shocked everyone. Sister Margaret, pale, clutched the cross around her neck and began to cry softly. Anne, struggling to maintain control, stepped back and looked at Jaden. He remained kneeling, motionless, his gaze lost on the chain. For a moment, the silence was broken only by the distant sound of rain, which tapped on the windows like impatient fingers. It was then that Harris noticed something else, a folded piece of paper hidden between the torn layers of foam. With trembling hands, he removed it and opened it. It was an old photograph, partially burned at the edges, showing two children, a girl and a boy. Anne put her hand to her mouth in disbelief. The boy in the photo was identical to Jaden, right down to the haircut, even the look in his eyes. The police officer stared at him for long seconds, unsure if what he saw was possible. "Is this some kind of old montage?" he asked, but no answer came. The entire orphanage seemed enveloped in a deep breath, as if something was awakening. Beneath those walls, Jaden, without taking his eyes off the photo, murmured, "She waited for me. I promised I'd come back." The nuns began to pray, some weeping, others trembling. The sound of their prayers echoed off the walls, mingling with the thunder that tore through the sky. But with each sacred word, the lamp trembled and the air grew heavier. The police officer took a step back, his face bathed in sweat. He wanted to leave, but something held him captive. A feeling that they hadn't discovered everything yet. The photo, the tape, the chain. They were just fragments, signs of a secret that wasn't content to remain hidden. And as the nuns tried to repair the torn mattress, Jaden slowly lifted his face. His eyes were teary but serene. And when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice sounded different, more mature, almost familiar. "She's closer now." The officer felt his spine go cold. In that moment, he understood that what they had found wasn't just a memory, it was a presence. And what came next would prove that the past wasn't just being revealed, it was coming back to claim what was taken from it. What happened in the following hours would never be forgotten by those inside St. Michael's orphanage. The discovery of the photograph and the blue ribbon didn't end the mystery, it only made it more vivid, as if the past had regained its breath and was once again walking within those ancient walls. Officer Harris, driven by the need to find a logical explanation, took the evidence for analysis. When he returned 2 days later, he was no longer the same man. His usual skepticism had dissolved, replaced by a pallor that betrayed fear. "The analysis confirmed it," he said, his voice trembling. "The fibers on the ribbon are over 15 years old. And there are organic traces on the mattress, human remains." The silence that followed was profound. Sister Margaret, already pale, asked in a whisper, "Whose?" Harris lowered her eyes and replied, "The missing girl, Grace Holloway." The news fell like a sentence. The nuns looked at each other in shock, and Anne brought her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back her tears. For years, the children had slept on that mattress, unaware that they were resting on the hidden body of a girl whom time had tried to erase. But most disturbing was Jaden. The boy, standing beside the bed, watched with eerie serenity. When the body was removed, he whispered, "I remember the sound of sewing when he locked me up." Harris recoiled in disbelief, and before anyone could respond, the windows slammed shut. The wind blew out the candles, and the orphanage plunged into darkness. A child's laughter echoed off the walls, soft, broken, impossible to ignore. When the light returned, Jaden was muttering an incomprehensible prayer. "She wants to be free," he said, before passing out. Harris never forgot those words, or the childlike voice that thanked him in the darkness that night. Because at St. Michael's, some souls don't cry for help, they just wait to be heard. In the days following the discovery, St. Michael's orphanage became a haven of silence and fear. The children were hastily transferred to other institutions. The nuns retreated into constant prayer, and the windows remained locked, as if the now colder wind carried memories no one dared to face. The case of Grace Holloway. It didn't take long for word to leak to local newspapers, but the diocese acted swiftly, demanding that the whole thing be treated as a sad episode from the past. Documents were sealed, evidence disappeared, and the official version was simplified to the point of grotesqueness. The remains of a child found in an old mattress during a renovation. No mention of Jaden, no reference to the blue ribbon, and certainly nothing about the supernatural events that followed. The police officer Harris, however, he couldn't shake it. His conscience wouldn't allow him to forget. He spent nights reviewing the reports, staring at the photograph of Jaden and Grace side by side, trying to find a rational explanation for what he'd witnessed. But the more he thought, the more he realized there was something beyond reality. That child couldn't know what he knew, couldn't describe in detail the sound of a needle stitching fabric and flesh, couldn't remember something that had happened before his birth. Yet, he knew. And that knowing tormented him. Meanwhile, the sister Margaret slowly withered. Away. Her former rigidity had given way to a silent guilt. In her prayers, she confessed to having felt the girl's presence many times, but had chosen to ignore it for fear of appearing weak. Now, all that remained was the knowledge that the orphanage had become a graveyard of innocence. During the last Mass, before its final closure, she wept silently as the bell rang for the last time, each chime sounding like a plea for forgiveness. Jaden, meanwhile, was sent to a shelter in another city. Since the day Grace's body was found, he hadn't smiled again. He avoided sleeping in beds, preferring the floor, as if he could no longer bear the weight of his dreams. Sometimes he would wake with a start and say he felt someone stroking his hair. The new caregivers watched him warily, unable to understand the distant look in the boy's eyes, who seemed to carry centuries inside him. Harris tried to visit him a few times, but was always met with the same response. "He's sleeping." Until one day, driven by an almost paternal need, he insisted and managed to see him. Jaden was sitting by the window, watching the sunset. The officer approached slowly, trying to say something comforting, but the boy spoke first. "She's at peace now, but the house isn't yet." Those words echoed in Harris's mind like a warning, because even after the orphanage closed, neighbors began reporting lights turning on by themselves, children's voices echoing in the distance, and the unmistakable sound of a bed creaking in the wee hours. No one dared to enter again. Time passed, reports were filed, those involved moved on with their lives, but the story of St. Michael's never stopped circulating, told in whispers, in bars and at masses, as an uncomfortable reminder that human justice is too small in the face of what is eternal. And although everyone believed that the case had been closed, there was something, or someone, still waiting to be heard. Because the past, when stitched together with silence, always finds a way to open up again, Time passed, and the story of St. Michael's Orphanage began to fade from the headlines, but not from the memories of those who lived through that winter. The building remained standing, isolated on the hilltop, covered in moss and silence, like a monument to what no one had the courage to face. Weeds grew around it, and the chapel bells, once a symbol of faith, now tinkled alone in the windy early mornings. It was as if the place still breathed, waiting for something or someone. And in another town, a boy grew up in silence, carrying the weight of what he had seen, heard, and in a way, shared. Jaden Cross. He hadn't been the same since that night. Social workers described him as too quiet for his age. He avoided playing with the other boys, rarely smiled, and the few times he slept he would wake up startled, calling Grace's name. But what was most striking was his serenity. He never showed violence, never shouted. He simply observed the world, with a gaze that seemed to transcend time, as if he were always in two places at once, here and somewhere where the pain still lingered. One day, during a grey autumn afternoon, Jaden was found by one of the caregivers sitting in front of the shelter window with a notebook on his lap. He was drawing something calmly, with firm, unhesitating strokes. When she approached, she saw that the paper depicted a simple bed, a blue ribbon draped over the pillow, and above it, a female figure made of light. The woman moved, asked what he was drawing. "A room where no one is afraid," he replied without looking up, "and where she can rest." That night, the boy tucked the drawing under his pillow and fell asleep. He dreamed of an open field, a light breeze, and the distant sound of children's laughter. He woke up crying but smiling at the same time. He simply said, "She's gone." His caregivers didn't understand, but they noticed that from that day on, Jaden began to change. He began to play. Again, to talk, to laugh at little things, as if part of the burden had been lifted along with Grace's soul. Months later, Officer Harris received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a copy of Jaden's drawing, the same image of the bed and the blue ribbon. In the bottom corner, in childish handwriting, it read, "She rested." The man kept the paper in his wallet and never told anyone. He would run his fingers over the drawing from time to time, as if touching a vivid memory. Years. Later, a group of volunteers attempted to restore the old orphanage. Upon opening the master bedroom, they found the room largely intact, except for a white chalk mark on the wall. The very words that had once been written by small, innocent hands. They left her locked up. The curious thing is that this time the letters were blurred by something that looked like moisture, but which under the light resembled the delicate trace of a tear. No one could explain. And as the sun set behind the hill, a gentle wind moved through the hallways, gently moving the torn fabric of the old mattress, as if someone, finally at peace, was saying goodbye. But the echo of that whisper still lingered in the air, hinting that even when the soul finds rest, the memory never sleeps completely. St. Michael's Orphanage remains to this day like a sleeping body atop a hill, enveloped by ancient trees that seem to hold a secret about what once happened there. Time has worn away its walls, ripped off chunks of the roof and dimmed the brightness of the windows, but there is something the wind has not been able to take, the feeling that those walls still breathe. From time to time, a curious visitor climbs up there and swears they hear distant laughter, light footsteps, the jingle of a lost chain, or the soft creak of a bed that should never move again. And while reason seeks explanations, the heart understands what the mind fears to admit. Some places never rest because they were made of silence. And silence has memory. People say that at nightfall, when the mist descends over the valley and covers the ancient iron cross that still stands at the entrance, a cold breeze passes through the empty corridors and spreads the subtle scent of old flowers, as if someone were leaving a final message, Perhaps it's simply the memory of Grace Holloway, drifting through the echoes of time. Or perhaps it's simply the weight of human guilt, transformed into wind. But those who know Jaden Cross's story know that nothing was coincidental, and that innocence, even when wounded, always finds a way to make itself heard, even if it takes a lifetime. Because there are truths that don't need a voice. They live in the eyes of children, in the walls that hold secrets, and in the places no one else wants to look. They are the ones that one day return like an insistent whisper, asking only that the world not forget. And St. Michael's Orphanage, no matter how much time erases it from the earth, will continue to exist within the memories of those who heard this story, a silent reminder that love, when denied, turns to lamentation, and that lamentation, when heard, finally finds rest. When no one listens to a child, the truth finds another way to be told. If this story touched you in any way, subscribe to the channel to hear more real and moving stories like this. Here, each story is an echo of the soul, and each forgotten voice finds a place to be remembered. Don't let the silence win. Click subscribe and continue with us on this journey where emotion and truth meet.